October 31st, 2012, was supposed to be just another Halloween in the coastal town of Bayshore, Maine. Charlie Morgan, age 11, wore his homemade sea monster costume with pride as he paraded in front of the hall mirror. His mother, Elaine, adjusted the rubber mask she'd helped him create, a blue-green creature with bulging eyes and fabric tentacles that hung from the sides. It was the product of weeks of effort, inspired by Charlie's obsession with ocean mysteries. "You sure you don't want me to come with you?" Elaine asked, tugging the mask into place. She was a single mother, raising Charlie alone since his father left when he was 4. "Mom, I'm going with Jake and his big brother." "I'm not a baby," Charlie protested, his voice muffled behind the mask. "Besides, Tyler is 16, that's practically an adult." Elaine sighed. Her son was growing up, asserting his independence in small ways. "Fine, but stay with Tyler the whole time. And be back by 8:30, not a minute later." Charlie nodded enthusiastically, the bulbous eyes on his mask bobbing comically. "We're just doing Shoreline Drive and maybe Harbor Street. All the good candy is there anyway." At 6 o'clock sharp, the doorbell rang. Jake Sullivan stood on the porch in a werewolf costume, his 17-year-old brother Tyler lingering at the bottom of the steps, already looking bored with his assigned chaperone duties. Tyler's costume was minimal, a hockey mask pushed up on his head and a splash of fake blood on his white t-shirt. "Cool monster," Jake exclaimed, admiring Charlie's handiwork. "Did you make it yourself?" "Mom helped," Charlie admitted, grabbing his orange plastic pumpkin bucket. "Let's go before all the good stuff is gone." Elaine watched from the doorway as the boys headed down the street, Charlie's sea monster tentacles bobbing with each step. The October air was crisp, and wisps of fog were already rolling in from the Atlantic, adding authenticity to the spooky atmosphere. She called out one final reminder about the curfew, which Charlie acknowledged with a backward wave. That was the last time Elaine Morgan saw her son. At 8:45 p.m., Elaine's phone rang. It was Jake's mother, Susan Sullivan, asking if Charlie had made it home all right. "What do you mean?" Elaine asked, her stomach instantly knotting. "He's with Jake and Tyler." Susan's voice turned anxious. "Tyler just brought Jake home. He said Charlie decided to go with another group of kids around 7:30. Some older boys from his class. Tyler thought you knew." Panic rose in Elaine's throat. "No, Charlie wouldn't do that. He knows better." Within an hour, the entire town of Bayshore was searching for Charlie Morgan. Police officers, volunteer firefighters, and dozens of neighbors combed the streets, abandoned their Halloween parties to join the increasingly desperate hunt. Flashlights swept across darkened yards and into drainage ditches. Calls of "Charlie" echoed through the fog-shrouded neighborhoods. Chief Robert Walsh, a burly man with a salt and pepper beard who'd policed Bayshore for 20 years, coordinated the search from the station. "The boy was last seen on Harbor Street near the old cannery," he informed the growing crowd of volunteers. "He was wearing a homemade sea monster costume, blue-green color with tentacles. If you find anything at all, you radio in immediately." Tyler Sullivan sat ashen-faced in the police station, repeating his story through tears. "I just turned away for like a minute. Some girl I know from school was there, and when I looked back, Charlie was talking to these older kids. They were all laughing about something. Then they all walked off together. I figured they were friends from his class or something." "What did these kids look like?" Officer Diaz pressed, her pen poised above her notepad. I don't know. It was dark and they were wearing costumes," Tyler stammered. "I think one was dressed as a ghost or something. Another had some kind of monster mask, too." By midnight, the search had expanded to include boats checking the harbor and shoreline. Bayshore was a fishing community nestled between steep cliffs and the unforgiving Atlantic. The sea was both provider and potential threat. Every child grew up hearing warnings about the dangerous currents and treacherous rocks. As dawn broke on November 1st, what they found only deepened the mystery. Charlie's sea monster mask washed up on Palmer Beach, about a mile south of town. The homemade creation was waterlogged, one of the fabric tentacles torn. Of Charlie himself, there was no sign. The discovery shifted the search entirely to the water. Coast Guard vessels crisscrossed the bay, while divers explored the underwater terrain near where the mask was found. But the sea refused to yield any further clues. Days passed, then weeks. Elaine Morgan appeared on local news, then national programs, clutching a school photo of her missing son, begging for information. Charlie's gap-toothed smile and freckled face became familiar to millions of Americans who watched the story unfold with horror and sympathy. Investigators followed every lead, interviewed every child who had been trick-or-treating that night. The older children Tyler had described seeing Charlie with, no one knew who they were. No parents reported their children mentioning meeting Charlie. It was as if these mysterious older kids had materialized from the fog itself. Suspicion inevitably fell on Tyler Sullivan. The teenager's story changed subtly with each retelling. Sometimes he claimed to have seen Charlie walk away with 2 older boys, sometimes 3. The girl he was supposedly talking to couldn't remember seeing him at all during the time Charlie vanished. But extensive investigation ultimately cleared Tyler. Security camera footage from a house on Harbor Street confirmed his presence far from the beach where Charlie's mask was found. The teenager was hiding something, likely the full extent of his negligence while supervising, but he wasn't directly responsible for Charlie's disappearance. As months passed, the searches became less frequent, the news reports shorter and less prominent. Charlie Morgan became another face on a database of missing children, his school photo replaced by an age progression image showing how he might look as he grew older. For Elaine Morgan, time stopped on Halloween 2012. She maintained Charlie's room exactly as he'd left it, his half-finished homework still on his desk, his collection of seashells still arranged on the windowsill. She established a scholarship in his name and organized an annual awareness walk on the anniversary of his disappearance. "I know he's out there somewhere," she told anyone who would listen. "A mother knows these things. Charlie is alive." But privately, in the darkness of sleepless nights, even Elaine had to confront the most likely truth, that somehow, on that foggy Halloween night, the sea had claimed her son, leaving only his handmade mask as a cruel memento of the child who'd loved ocean mysteries. What no one in Bayshore could possibly know was that the truth about Charlie Morgan was stranger and more terrible than anyone imagined, and that it would take exactly 10 years for the sea to offer up another clue. The coastal winds of Bayshore had a way of carrying memories, whispers of the past that twisted through the salt-weathered buildings like the persistent fog. 10 years after Charlie Morgan's disappearance, the town had changed in subtle ways. Storefronts had turned over, fishing boats had changed hands, children had grown up and moved away. But for some, time had frozen on that Halloween night in 2012. Elaine Morgan still lived in the same craftsman house on Maple Street, though her hair had grayed prematurely, and deep lines framed her mouth. She worked as a librarian at Bayshore Elementary, where she could feel close to the memory of her son. Every child who checked out books about sea creatures or marine biology received special attention from Ms. Morgan, some kindness that made the newer residents whisper about the strange, sad library lady. Jake Sullivan, now 21, had returned to Bayshore after his first year of college, unable to shake the guilt that had shadowed him since he was 11 years old. He'd gone to therapy, changed schools twice, but Charlie's disappearance haunted him. He'd been there. He should have noticed something. His brother Tyler had moved to California immediately after high school, unable to bear the sideways glances from neighbors who still suspected him of knowing more than he'd revealed. Chief Robert Walsh had retired 3 years earlier, the Morgan case his one great unsolved mystery. He still kept a copy of the case file in his home office, reviewing it occasionally, searching for something everyone had missed. On October 29, 2022, 2 days before the 10-year anniversary of Charlie's disappearance, 13-year-old Mia Chen was collecting shells on Palmer Beach when something caught her eye. The morning tide had receded, leaving behind the usual debris, seaweed, driftwood, the occasional piece of sea glass. But half buried in the wet sand was something white and smooth. At first, Mia thought it was just another shell, but as she brushed away the sand, she realized it was a mask. A simple white face with black accents around the eyes and lips. It looked like the kind of blank mask artists paint, or that people decorate for masquerade parties. But this one wasn't plain white anymore. Something dark stained one side, and there were markings etched into the forehead, symbols or letters she didn't recognize. Mia's father, Dr. James Chen, was the town's new medical examiner, having moved to Bayshore just 18 months earlier. When his daughter showed him her discovery, his professional instincts immediately recognized the dark stain as old blood. The markings, however, were beyond his expertise. They appeared to be carefully carved symbols arranged in a specific pattern. "We need to take this to the police," he told his daughter, carefully placing the mask in a clean plastic bag. "It might be important." Sergeant Michelle Diaz, now acting chief since Walsh's retirement, examined the mask with growing unease. Unlike most of Bayshore's current residents, she remembered the Morgan case vividly. She had been one of the officers who interviewed Tyler Sullivan, who coordinated the first searches, who had to look into Elaine Morgan's desperate eyes and admit they had no answers. "The timing's too specific to be coincidence," she told Dr. Chen after Mia had been thanked and sent to wait in the station lobby. 10 years almost to the day after Charlie disappeared, another mask washes up on the same beach where we found his. She laid out photographs from the original case file. The sea monster mask with its torn tentacles, waterlogged but recognizable as the product of a mother's love and a child's imagination. Next to the clinical white mask with its disturbing markings, the contrast was striking. "I'll send this to the state lab," Chen offered. "The blood might yield DNA if we're lucky. And I have a colleague at the university who specializes in symbology. He might be able to identify these markings." Diaz nodded. "Keep this quiet for now. The anniversary's always hard on this town, especially on Elaine Morgan. If this turns out to be nothing," but both knew this wasn't nothing. The mask had appeared with too much deliberate timing. Someone wanted it found now, 10 years later. 2 days later, on Halloween, the preliminary results arrived. The blood on the mask belonged to a male with DNA markers consistent with Caucasian ancestry. Not enough for a definitive match, but not inconsistent with Charlie Morgan. More surprising were the findings about the mask itself. "It's old," Chen explained to Diaz. "My colleague says it's hand-carved bone, likely human. The symbols are a mixture of very old writing systems. Some appear to be Proto-Sinaitic, others resemble Phoenician characters. They form some kind of ritual inscription." "Ritual?" Diaz repeated the word, leaving a chill. "What kind of ritual?" Chen hesitated. My colleague was reluctant to speculate without further research, but he mentioned connections to ancient sea deities, particularly those associated with sacrifice and transformation. That evening, as children throughout Bayshore prepared their Halloween costumes, blissfully unaware of the tragedy the date held for some in their community, Sergeant Diaz made the difficult decision to visit Elaine Morgan. The grieving mother deserved to know about this development before it potentially became public. Elaine was sitting on her porch, a bowl of candy beside her chair, though no trick-or-treaters ever came to her house. Parents steered their children to other streets, away from the sadness that permeated the Morgan property. The sea monster mask, the original found a decade ago, sat on a small table beside her, encased in a clear preservation box. Each Halloween, Elaine displayed it, a ritual of remembrance most found morbid but that she couldn't abandon. "We found something, Elaine," Diaz said gently, sitting in the empty chair. "I don't want to give you false hope, but we believe it may be connected to Charlie." As Diaz explained about the bone mask, its timing, the blood, and the strange symbols, Elaine's expression transformed from polite attention to intense focus. Without a word, she stood and disappeared into the house, returning moments later with a thick folder. "I need to show you something," she said, her voice stronger than it had been in years. "Something I've never told the police because I was afraid you'd think I was crazy." From the folder, she withdrew printouts, newspaper clippings, and handwritten notes. "After Charlie disappeared, I researched everything I could about Bayshore's history, looking for similar cases. There wasn't much officially, but I found rumors, old stories." She laid out a newspaper clipping from 1972, yellowed with age. The headline read, "Local boy missing after Halloween festivities." Below was a grainy photo of a 10-year-old boy named Samuel Hayes. "And this," Elaine continued, showing a printout from an archived newspaper database. "October 1942. Child vanishes during Halloween blackout. 8-year-old Joseph Miller had disappeared during a wartime coastal blackout. Diaz felt the blood drain from her face as Elaine continued presenting her evidence. 1912, 1882, 1852. Every 30 years, stretching back as far as local records existed, a boy between the ages of 8 and 12 had vanished on or around Halloween in Bayshore. Some were officially recorded as drownings, though bodies were never recovered. Others remained unsolved disappearances. All had occurred during years when Halloween fell close to high tide cycles. I thought I was seeing patterns that weren't there, Elaine said, her hands trembling. Grieving mothers look for meaning. But now this mask, these symbols. Diaz studied the material with growing horror. Why didn't Chief Walsh find this pattern? Because most of these weren't properly investigated. Different eras, different standards, poorer families, children who weren't always missed right away. Elaine's voice held no accusation, just the steady certainty of someone who had dedicated a decade to research. And I only found the pattern because I was looking for it, because I needed there to be a reason. As the sun set over Bayshore, casting long shadows across Elaine's porch, the two women sat surrounded by evidence of something unthinkable, not a single tragedy, but a pattern spanning centuries. Something ancient and terrible was connected to their small coastal town, something that took a child every 30 years on Halloween night. If I'm right, Elaine said, her voice barely audible above the distant sound of waves, then in 2042, another boy will disappear. Unless we stop it, Diaz replied, gathering the documents with new determination. Unless we figure out what this is and end it now. Neither woman noticed the figure watching from across the street, partially hidden behind an ancient oak tree. A tall silhouette, unnaturally still, observing the house where a sea monster mask sat in its preservation case, a tribute to the most recent child taken by the sea. As night fully claimed Bayshore and costumed children began their rounds, the figure melted away into the gathering fog, leaving no trace but a lingering chill in the air where it had stood. Dawn broke over Bayshore on November 1, 2022, revealing a town transformed by the previous night's revelations. Sergeant Diaz had spent the night at the station, spreading Elaine Morgan's research across conference tables, creating timelines that stretched back nearly 2 centuries. The pattern was undeniable once you saw it. Every 30 years, a boy vanished into the October sea, leaving grieving families and unanswered questions. By 7 a.m., Diaz had assembled an impromptu task force. Herself, retired Chief Walsh, called in despite his retirement, Dr. James Chen and Professor Alan Mercer, an expert in ancient religions hastily recruited from the State University. Elaine Morgan sat at the head of the table, her decade of obsessive research making her the unexpected authority. I've confirmed the pattern, Professor Mercer said, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses as he examined the bone mask under a portable light. The markings are consistent with an extremely old cult dedicated to a sea deity the Romans called Pontus Vorax, literally the devouring sea. Records of worship date back to pre-Roman settlements along the Atlantic coast. A cult? Chief Walsh's skepticism was evident. You're saying there's been a secret cult in Bayshore for 200 years abducting children? Not exactly, Mercer clarified. This appears to be something more inherited. The inscriptions speak of a covenant, a bargain struck between the early settlers and the sea, protection for the fishing fleet, prosperity for the town, in exchange for tribute. The word hung heavy in the room. Tribute. A child. Every 30 years. Doctor. Chen cleared his throat. The bone this mask is carved from. I've confirmed it's human. Frontal bone from the skull, to be precise. And based on measurements, it likely came from a child. Elaine's face remained impassive. A woman who had lived with horror for so long that fresh revelations barely registered. You're talking about human sacrifice, she said flatly. Children sacrificed to some sea god. I'm talking about historical evidence of belief systems, Mercer corrected carefully. Whether any entity actually exists is beyond my expertise, but the belief clearly existed, and beliefs, especially those maintained over generations, have power of their own. Diaz tapped a pencil against the table. So we're looking for a person or persons who believe in this covenant. Someone who's taken responsibility for maintaining it. The Keeper, Elaine interjected. In my research, I found references to a position passed down through generations. The Keeper of the Covenant. Always described as tall, always connected to the sea. A tall suspect, Walsh muttered. That narrows it down to about 500 men in town. But Elaine was already spreading out property records she'd collected. I traced land ownership patterns around the time of each disappearance. One property always changes hands within a year before each incident. The old lighthouse keeper's cottage on North Point. Diaz leaned forward. Who owns it now? A corporation called Oceanus Holdings purchased it 18 months ago. I can't trace the ownership beyond shell companies. The team split up with clear assignments. Diaz would investigate Oceanus Holdings. Walsh would review each historical case with fresh eyes. Chen would conduct further analysis of the mask. Mercer would research the cult's practices more thoroughly. Elaine would compile everything she knew about the lighthouse cottage. They reconvened at sunset, each bringing troubling new information. The property trail led to a bewildering array of shell companies. The historical cases revealed similar patterns. Each missing boy had been described as special in some way, often artistic or unusually perceptive. The bone mask contained trace elements suggesting long submersion in a unique underwater environment with unusual mineral content. The cult apparently believed that the children weren't killed but transformed, made into vessels for the voice of the deep. We're missing something fundamental, Diaz said, frustration evident. If this has been happening for 2 centuries, why hasn't anyone connected these cases before? Because it protects itself, came a new voice from the doorway. Everyone turned to see Jake Sullivan standing there, his face pale beneath his dark hair. At 21, he still carried the guilt of the 11-year-old who had lost his friend. I've been having dreams, Jake said, stepping into the room. Since Charlie disappeared. The same dream, over and over. I see him walking into the water, following something. Not being dragged, following willingly. And there's a tall figure watching from the rocks. In the dreams, I know things I shouldn't know. What kind of things? Diaz asked carefully. About the others. About Samuel Hayes in 1972 and Joseph Miller in 1942. I can see their faces, though I've never seen photos. I know that Samuel loved to draw seascapes and that Joseph could predict storms before they came. Jake's voice trembled. I know that Charlie isn't dead. None of them are. They're somewhere else. Somewhere beneath. Professor Mercer stepped forward. The cult believed that the chosen children had special perception, sensitivity to the voice of the deity. They weren't killed but transformed into intermediaries. The dreams suggest you may have similar sensitivity, young man. I'm not special, Jake protested. Charlie was the special one. He could stand at the shore and tell you exactly when the tide would turn without checking charts. He knew where to find the rarest shells. The sea spoke to him somehow. And now it's speaking to you, Elaine said quietly. Through dreams. As night fell over Bayshore, the group formulated a plan. If the pattern held true, the lighthouse keeper's cottage would contain evidence, perhaps even identify the current keeper. Despite Walsh's insistence that they obtain a warrant, Diaz made the call. They would investigate immediately, operating on the thin legal justification of exigent circumstances. The North Point Lighthouse had been decommissioned decades earlier, but the keeper's cottage remained. A weathered 2-story structure perched on the rocky promontory, windows facing the endless Atlantic. Most locals avoided the place, claiming it felt unwelcoming. As Diaz, Walsh, and Jake approached through the darkness, they understood why. The cottage seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The door was unlocked, swinging open at Diaz's touch. Inside, the cottage was meticulously maintained but eerily impersonal. No photographs, no mail, no signs of daily life. Just nautical equipment, ancient navigation tools, and walls covered with maps of the sea floor. Basement, Jake whispered, drawn to a heavy door at the back of the kitchen. It's down there. The stone steps descended into darkness. Walsh's flashlight revealed a chamber carved directly into the coastal bedrock, far larger than the cottage above would suggest. The walls were inscribed with the same symbols found on the bone mask. Glass cases displayed artifacts, primitive fishing implements, stone tablets, and, most disturbingly, masks. Dozens of white masks identical to the one found on the beach, each labeled with a year and a name. In the center of the room stood a pool of still black water, about 10 feet in diameter, disappearing into a tunnel that led out beneath the cliff face toward the open ocean. "My God," Walsh breathed, his flashlight illuminating the most recent mask display. The inscription read, "Charles Morgan 2012" next to an empty pedestal. The mask washed up because it wasn't properly secured, Diaz realized. Something interrupted the ritual. Jake moved as if in a trance toward the dark pool. "They go through here. This connects to sea caves beneath the town. Charlie is down there. I can feel him." Before they could stop him, Jake had stripped off his jacket and shoes. "I've seen this place in my dreams for 10 years. The Keeper takes them through this passage to where they're transformed. They're waiting." "Jake, don't!" Diaz lunged forward, but too late. The young man had already slipped into the dark water and disappeared beneath the surface. Walsh's radio crackled to life with Elaine's voice from the command center. "We've identified the owner of Oceanus Holdings. It's Tyler Sullivan, Jake's brother." As the implication sank in, the cottage door slammed shut above them. Footsteps crossed the floor. Measured, unhurried. The Keeper had returned, trapping them in the chamber of his ancestors. And beneath the black water, Jake Sullivan swam deeper into darkness, following the pull of something ancient that had been waiting 10 years for his return. Tyler Sullivan stood at the top of the basement stairs, silhouetted against the dim light filtering down from the cottage above. At 27, he cut an imposing figure, tall and lean with features that had hardened from the boy Diaz remembered interviewing 10 years earlier. In his hand, he held an ornate dagger crafted from what appeared to be whalebone. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "None of you should be here." "Tyler," Walsh began, hand instinctively moving toward his service weapon. "Put down the knife. Let's talk about this." Tyler descended the stairs with deliberate steps. "There's nothing to talk about. You've interfered with something you can't possibly understand. My brother has made his choice, the choice I was too weak to make 10 years ago." "What did you do to Charlie Morgan?" Diaz demanded, positioning herself between Tyler and the water where Jake had disappeared. "I did nothing to him. I merely showed him the way, as my grandfather showed me." Tyler gestured to the pool. "Charlie was chosen. They're all chosen, boys who can hear the voice of the deep. My family has served as keepers for 7 generations, guiding the chosen ones to their transformation." "Transformation into what?" Walsh asked, trying to keep Tyler talking while Diaz subtly reached for her radio to alert backup. "Into vessels." Tyler's eyes gleamed with fervent belief. "Their consciousness merges with the entity beneath the waves. They become part of something ancient and vast. In return, the sea protects Bayshore, provides for our fleet, keeps our waters calm while other towns suffer shipwrecks and decline." As he spoke, the pool behind Diaz began to bubble and churn. Something was rising from the depths. Meanwhile, beneath the surface, Jake Sullivan swam through a winding tunnel that logic said should have drowned him minutes ago. Yet he breathed easily, propelled by currents that seemed to guide rather than hinder his movement. The tunnel opened into a vast underwater cavern, illuminated by bioluminescent algae that cast an eerie blue-green glow across rock formations that couldn't possibly exist through natural means. Spiraling columns, and perfectly smooth archways carved with the same ancient symbols found on the bone masks. And there, arranged in a circle at the center of the cavern, were figures that at first appeared to be statues, humanoid but wrong somehow, their proportions stretched, skin with the texture of smooth sea glass, faces obscured by white bone masks identical to the one found on the beach. One figure detached from the circle and approached. Though the dimensions were distorted, taller, thinner, Jake recognized the movement, the slight tilt of the head that had been characteristic of his childhood friend. "Charlie," he whispered, his voice somehow carrying through the water. The figure reached up and removed its mask, revealing a face that was both familiar and alien. Charlie's features preserved as they had been at 11, but transformed. The skin translucent, eyes enlarged and entirely black, hairless scalp traced with faint patterns of luminescence. "You came," the creature said, its voice resonating directly in Jake's mind. "I've been calling you for so long." "What happened to you?" Jake asked, fighting the instinct to recoil. "I became more than I was," Charlie replied, gesturing to the circle of transformed children behind him. "We all did. The oldest of us can remember when the first ships came to Bayshore, when the covenant was made. We guide the ships, calm the storms, make the fish plentiful, and in return we receive a new brother every 30 years, one who can hear the sea's voice, who can join our consciousness." "You were taken," Jake insisted. "Your mother has been searching for you for 10 years. A ripple of what might have been sadness crossed Charlie's inhuman features. "I was shown the way by the keeper. I chose to follow. Each of us must choose." Back in the basement chamber, Tyler continued his explanation. "My grandfather was the keeper in 1992. He showed me my responsibility. But when the time came in 2012, I hesitated. I was supposed to guide Charlie to the water, but I couldn't do it. I left him on the beach." "So how did Charlie disappear?" Walsh pressed. "Grandfather stepped in. He took my place that night, approached Charlie in a ghost costume. But my failure angered the deep. The tribute must be given willingly by the current keeper." Tyler's face hardened. "My hesitation caused 10 years of hardship for Bayshore. Haven't you noticed? Fish stocks depleted. 3 major storms that damaged the harbor. The tourism decline. I've spent 10 years preparing to make amends." "By sending your own brother into that pool?" Diaz was incredulous. Jake was always meant to be the next vessel. He heard the dreams but refused to acknowledge them. Now he's finally accepted his purpose. The churning in the pool intensified. A hand broke the surface. Not Jake's, but something with elongated fingers and skin like polished stone. "Your backup won't make it in time," Tyler said, noticing Diaz's hand on her radio. "And even if they did, how would you explain any of this? A centuries-old covenant with a sea deity? Children transformed into aquatic entities? They'd commit you before they arrested me." "People have died, Tyler," Walsh growled. "Children stolen from their families." "None of them died," Tyler corrected. "They transcended, became more than human, protected this town for generations. Without the covenant, Bayshore would have vanished like so many coastal villages, swept away by storms, economically ruined by depleted fishing grounds. We make one sacrifice every 30 years to save thousands of lives." Underground, Jake faced Charlie's transformed visage with growing horror and fascination. The other figures had gathered around now. He recognized Joseph Miller from 1942, with his Depression-era features preserved but altered. Samuel Hayes from 1972, with what had once been artistic hands now webbed and elongated. "You want me to become like you," Jake realized. "We want you to complete the circle," Charlie corrected. "This was always your destiny. That's why you've dreamed of us for 10 years. But there's one problem. You weren't properly prepared by the Keeper. You came on your own. Tyler was supposed to guide me? The Keeper must perform the ritual, mark the chosen one, and present them to the deep with the proper offerings. You've come unmarked, unprepared. The Covenant cannot accept you this way." Jake felt the current shifting around him, pushing him back toward the tunnel entrance. "What happens now?" "Now you must return with the knowledge," Charlie said, his black eyes unreadable. "The Covenant has been maintained imperfectly. The deep grows restless. Either the proper tribute must be presented, or the Covenant must be broken completely. There is no middle path. And if the Covenant breaks?" The circle of transformed children moved in perfect unison, their voices melding into one multi-toned response. "Then we all return to claim what's ours." In the chamber above, Diaz and Walsh found themselves facing not just Tyler, but what was emerging from the pool, a figure of nightmare, humanoid but stretched to impossible proportions, skin like polished abalone shell, face obscured by a bone mask carved with ancient symbols. It rose to a height of nearly 7 feet, water streaming from its form. "The first vessel," Tyler whispered reverently. "The original, from before written records." The entity reached out with impossible speed, not toward the officers but toward Tyler, wrapping elongated fingers around his throat. Tyler's eyes widened in confusion and betrayal. "You failed your duty," a voice echoed, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere. "The Covenant demands perfection." At that moment, Jake burst from the water, gasping for air. "The Covenant is broken," he shouted. "They're coming back!" The entity released Tyler, who collapsed to the ground and turned toward Jake. For a moment it seemed poised to strike, then it melted like wax, collapsing into a puddle of iridescent liquid that flowed back into the pool. "What the hell just happened?" Walsh demanded. Jake climbed out of the pool, shivering. "The transformed children, they're all down there, not dead, changed. But the Covenant is failing. Tyler didn't follow the proper ritual and I went down unmarked. Now they're all coming back." "Coming back?" Diaz echoed. "What does that mean?" "It means," Tyler gasped from the floor, clutching his bruised throat, "that instead of one child every 30 years, they'll take as many as they want. The protection ends tonight. Bayshore is doomed." As if in response to his words, the ground beneath them trembled. From deep below came a sound like the largest bell ever forged, a resonant, inhuman toll that vibrated through their bones. "We need to get out of here," Jake urged. "Now!" They dragged the semi-conscious Tyler up the stairs, just as the pool began to overflow, black water spilling across the chamber floor with unnatural speed. Outside, they found backup officers arriving, summoned by Diaz's earlier call. "Evacuate the waterfront," Diaz ordered. "All of it. Get everyone at least a mile inland." As sirens began to wail through Bayshore, Jake turned to face the sea. In the distance, bioluminescent shapes moved beneath the surface, dozens of them, heading toward shore. "We broke the Covenant," he whispered, "and now they're coming to collect." Dawn was still hours away when the evacuation of Bayshore began in earnest. Police cruisers moved through the streets with blaring sirens, officers shouting through bullhorns for residents to move inland. Many dismissed the warnings as an overreaction to some minor threat, a gas leak or minor coastal flooding, until they saw the water. The tide, which should have been receding according to charts, was instead advancing with unnatural speed. As it moved up the beach, it glowed with bioluminescence, illuminating the night in eerie blue-green pulses. More disturbing were the shapes moving beneath the surface, elongated humanoid figures, swimming with inhuman grace toward the shore. Elaine Morgan stood at the emergency command center established at Bayshore High School, a mile inland and on higher ground. Alongside Professor Mercer and Dr. Chen, she watched the live video feed from cameras positioned along the waterfront. "They're returning," Mercer whispered, adjusting his glasses as he studied the footage. "All of them. Every child taken over centuries." Jake Sullivan burst into the command center, still dripping from his underwater journey, with Diaz and Walsh close behind, supporting the semi-conscious Tyler between them. "We have maybe an hour," Jake announced without preamble. "They're coming to collect what they believe they're owed. Decades of tributes that should have been properly given. But Charlie and the others were taken," Elaine protested. "How can they claim more are owed?" "The Covenant was specific," Jake explained, the knowledge from his encounter with Charlie flowing through him. Each child had to be properly prepared, marked, and willing. Charlie wasn't properly prepared because Tyler failed his duty as keeper. The Covenant has been imperfectly maintained for decades. Now they want compensation. Tyler slumped into a chair, his arrogance evaporated. "My grandfather cut corners with the rituals. He thought the symbolic actions were unnecessary superstition. Just get the child to the water. That was his focus. But the old ways mattered. The preparation, the markings, the bone masks made from previous vessels, all of it was part of the Covenant. How do we stop them?" Diaz asked, the practical question cutting through the mysticism. All eyes turned to Professor Mercer, who was frantically flipping through ancient texts he'd brought from the university. "Covenants like this typically have dissolution clauses, a way to break the agreement permanently, rather than merely breaching it." "The first vessel," Tyler murmured. "The original mask must be destroyed while speaking the words of unbinding." "Where is the original mask?" Walsh demanded. "It would be the oldest one in the basement chamber," Tyler replied, "displayed in the center." A glance at the video feed showed the keeper's cottage was already partially submerged, waves crashing against its walls with unnatural force. "I'll go," Jake said quietly. "Charlie showed me things underwater. I can reach it." "No," Elaine interrupted with sudden authority. "I have to do it. A parent of a taken child must break the covenant. That's why they left Charlie's mask on the beach for me to find. They've been trying to show us how to end this." Before anyone could argue, the power went out, emergency generators humming to life seconds later. On the restored video feed, they could see the first of the transformed children emerging from the sea, Charlie in the lead, his elongated figure moving with fluid grace across the wet sand, bone mask gleaming in the moonlight. Bayshore's waterfront was fully evacuated now, but the entities weren't pursuing the fleeing residents. Instead, they converged on specific houses, the homes of children. Through windows and doors they entered, silent as shadows. "They're marking replacements," Tyler explained, horror in his voice. "Every child they find suitable will be taken back with them unless we end this now." The improvised rescue team moved with desperate speed, Diaz, Walsh, Jake, and Elaine in one vehicle, headed for the rapidly flooding waterfront. The roads were chaos, jammed with evacuating residents. They abandoned the car half a mile from shore, continuing on foot through wind that had risen to gale force. The keeper's cottage was now surrounded by churning water, waves crashing against its stone foundation. The front door had been ripped away, and black water filled the first floor. "I can't swim," Elaine confessed as they stood at the edge of what had been the front yard, now submerged under 3 feet of seawater. "I'll help you," Jake promised. "We'll go together." With Walsh and Diaz providing cover, Jake and Elaine waded toward the cottage. The water was preternaturally cold, seeming to draw heat from their bodies with vampiric efficiency. As they reached the doorway, something massive moved beneath the surface, larger than any of the transformed children they'd seen. "The first vessel," Jake whispered. "It's still here." They pushed through into the cottage where the water reached their chests. The basement door was fully submerged now, the chamber below completely flooded. "I'll go down first," Jake said. "Find the original mask. You follow when I signal." "No." Elaine gripped his arm. Together or not at all, Charlie was alone. No more children faced this alone. Something in her fierce maternal protection broke through Jake's fear. Together they filled their lungs and plunged beneath the surface, kicking down the stone steps into darkness. The basement chamber was transformed, the cases broken open, artifacts floating freely, the inscribed walls now glowing with the same bioluminescence that marked the transformed children. At the center, where the pool had been, a vortex now formed, swirling toward the sea cave entrance. Jake pointed to a stone pedestal on the far side of the chamber. Atop it sat a mask unlike the others, larger, more elaborate, carved from what appeared to be an entire human skull. Symbols etched into every inch of its surface, the first vessel's original form. As they swam toward it, a figure interposed itself. Charlie, his transformed body more fluid underwater, black eyes unreadable behind his bone mask. He made no move to stop them, simply watching as Jake and Elaine approached the pedestal. Elaine reached for the ancient mask, her lungs burning for air. As her fingers touched the yellowed bone, Charlie suddenly moved, placing his elongated hand over hers. For a moment, she thought he meant to stop her. Then she realized he was helping her, adding his strength to hers as they lifted the mask from its resting place. With the mask secured, Jake and Elaine kicked desperately toward the surface, lungs screaming for oxygen. They broke into the air-filled first floor with gasping breaths, clinging to floating furniture. "The words," Elaine panted. "What are the words of unbinding?" Outside the cottage, the transformed children had finished their grim task of marking Bayshore's youth. Dozens of them now surrounded the cottage, bone masks gleaming in the darkness, waiting. "I don't know the words," Jake admitted, panic rising. "Tyler never told us." From the doorway came a familiar voice. "I know them." Tyler Sullivan stood in the shattered entrance, water swirling around his waist. "I know the words. I've known them my whole life. The Keeper must speak them. This is your fault," Elaine accused, clutching the ancient mask. "You took my son." "I failed my duty," Tyler corrected. "Now I'll fulfill it properly, one last time." He waded toward them, hand extended for the mask. Elaine hesitated, then passed it to him. Tyler held the skull mask above the churning water. With this breaking, I dissolve the covenant made by my ancestors. The tribute ends. The service ends. The transformation ends. What was given is reclaimed. What was changed is restored. The sea and the shore part ways until time's end. As the final word left his lips, he brought the ancient mask down with savage force against the stone wall. It shattered into dust, fragments disappearing into the swirling water. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the cottage began to shake, stones falling from the walls as the very foundations seemed to liquefy beneath them. "Out!" Jake shouted, grabbing Elaine's arm. "Now!" They fought their way through the surging water toward the entrance, where Walsh and Diaz were shouting encouragement. Tyler remained behind, a strange calm settling over his features as the cottage began to collapse around him. "One last tribute," he whispered as the walls gave way. "A keeper for the broken covenant." Outside, the transformed children began to convulse, their elongated bodies contorting as the magic that had preserved and changed them for generations began to unravel. One by one, they collapsed into the water, not as monsters but as children again, human and vulnerable. Jake and Elaine reached safety as the cottage imploded, taking Tyler with it into the depths. All along the shore, the transformed children were returning to their original forms, some modern in appearance, others wearing clothes from decades or centuries past, all of them children again, confused and afraid, as they staggered out of the receding tide. And among them, walking unsteadily up the beach as the first light of dawn broke over Bayshore, was an 11-year-old boy in the tattered remains of a sea monster costume. Charlie Morgan, unchanged by the decade that had passed, looked up with perfectly normal brown eyes to see his mother running toward him across the wet sand. "Mom," he called, his voice the same as it had been on Halloween night 10 years ago. "Mom, what happened? Where am I?" Elaine fell to her knees in the sand, gathering her son into her arms with sobs that came from the deepest place in her soul. "You're home, Charlie. You're finally home." All across the waterfront, similar reunions took place. Confused children being embraced by elderly parents who had never stopped searching, by siblings now decades older, by a town that had forgotten their names, but would never forget this day. As the sun rose fully over Bayshore, the sea retreated to its normal boundary, leaving behind only the chalk-white bone masks scattered across the sand. Volunteers collected them carefully, each one representing a child returned from the deep. The covenant that had protected and cursed Bayshore for centuries was broken. The price had been high. Tyler Sullivan's life, decades of grief for countless families, an entire town forced to confront its darkest secret. But as Charlie Morgan stood on the beach, squinting at a world 10 years more advanced than the one he'd left, the cost seemed, at last, to be worth it. "What happens now?" Charlie asked, holding tightly to his mother's hand as medical teams arrived to care for the returned children. "Now we start over," Elaine replied, kissing the top of his head. "All of us. Together." Behind them, Jake Sullivan stood at the water's edge, watching the gentle waves that now seemed ordinary, devoid of the otherworldly presence that had haunted his dreams for a decade. His brother was gone, having made the only atonement he could for his role in the centuries of suffering. "Goodbye, Tyler," he whispered to the sea. "No more keepers, no more vessels, no more children lost on Halloween night." As Bayshore began the long process of healing, the bone masks were collected and ceremonially burned, their ashes scattered far out to sea. The records of the covenant were preserved as a grim reminder of what happens when a community sacrifices its most vulnerable for prosperity. Charlie Morgan and the other returned children faced a unique challenge, adjusting to lives interrupted, to families aged, to a world that had continued without them. Some had been in the deep for decades, some for centuries. Each bore no memory of their time as vessels, recalling only the moment they had followed the keeper into the water. 1 year later, on Halloween night, Bayshore held a new celebration, the Festival of Return. Lanterns floated in the harbor, one for each child who had been taken and returned. The lighthouse on North Point, rebuilt after the cottage's destruction, shone with warm, welcoming light, rather than the cold blue glare that had marked it for centuries. And if sometimes, during high tides and full moons, strange luminescence could be seen in the deep waters off Bayshore's coast, well, the sea would always have its mysteries, but never again would it take the town's children as tribute. That covenant was broken. That hunger finally sated. The masks had washed away, but the memory remained. A reminder that the darkest depths are not in the ocean, but in what people will sacrifice when fear overwhelms conscience. And in that knowledge perhaps was the greatest protection Bayshore could ever have.